Like James Bond, Strategy Aaron returns. I hope you all had an awesome holiday. I have so many great guests lined up over the coming months, and some really exciting plans. But to kick off this new season of the pod, I thought we'd start with something nice and fun, especially after the last 24 hours. Film scholar and close friend of the pod, Paul Klein, joins me for a big geek out over 007. Paul and I have deep love for the franchise, as becomes clear in our talk. As well as discussing the role of strategy in the films, we also talk about the impact that GoldenEye had on us, the importance of Timothy Dalton, and whether Bond is actually a class warrior. We also address that gauche, try-hard billionaire rocket maker with Nazi sympathies, Sir Hugo Drax, Bond's nemesis in Moonraker. I really hope you enjoy the show. Paul, well, welcome again. So you had the what's the word? You were the first return guest.
Sure.
And now you're the first one to appear for a third time.
So nice we did it thrice.
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about James Bond and strategy. I felt I had to insert the James because when I mentioned it to someone else earlier on, I just said Bond, and they were like a financial bond.
Something that makes more sense.
James Bond. And I thought I would start by asking, how did your love of James Bond start?
Oh, that's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think we all have a personal relationship with James Bond in a certain way. We all got introduced in some way. My introduction was GoldenEye, and I was, I think, in kindergarten at the time, and my dad woke me up. It must have been like 8 o'clock at night, right? Because I'm 5 years old or something. My dad woke me up and he was like, "We're going to go to the movie." And I remember thinking it was so cool to go to a movie, what felt like the middle of the night, right? And so it's probably an 8:30 or 9 o'clock show. But we saw James Bond, and I'm 5. It went totally over my head, but it became such a, lovely memory that all of a sudden James Bond had this like huge emotional, personal resonance for me. And so throughout the Brosnan era, every time one came out, as I got older, we made sure to go see them. And then I was in high school when Casino Royale came out, and I am maybe ashamed to say I saw Casino Royale 17 times in movie theaters in high school. I went opening night, had so much fun that I went back the first thing the next morning to see it again. Took a lunch break and then was like, I want to see it one more time. And it just sort of spiraled from there. And I, since then it's just been a love. I think they're so much fun. I've read all the books. I've seen all the movies, they're great. I'm super excited to be here to talk about something like James Bond.
I feel like, the Bond you came of age with is the default Bond for you, whoever it is. Yeah. My mum was born in 62. She came of age in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
And for her, Roger Moore is the Bond. Whereas for me, it's Pierce Brosnan. Because that was
your Bond.
Yeah.
My dad's the same way. He's a Roger Moore Bond guy. For a long time, Brosnan was my answer. Brosnan's no longer my answer, but there's a deep love there, even when it gets super goofy. I
mean, my sort of history with it is a bit complex because apparently when I was like a baby, my granddad would sit me in front of the TV while a Bond film was on.
Sure.
So I think subconsciously I was taking in Goldfinger, Doctor No, and then also I can still remember a terrifying dream I had when I was like 3,
Okay.
4, something like that, about Robert Davi, who was the villain in License to Kill.
Uh-huh.
Like he was like trying to kill me in this dream, and I can still remember it. And then after that, like the one that I was like fully conscious of was GoldenEye. And I was
Robert
like,
Davi's a scary character, so
he is a scary
or a scary actor, I suppose.
Yeah.
That the face is it's memorable. There's a reason why he's a villain.
yeah, and the Goonies as well.
Right.
And actually, I was thinking on the train earlier when I was writing down notes that in a way, GoldenEye influenced a lot of my understanding of both Bond and arguably my larger worldview.
Okay, say more.
Yeah. Firstly, don't trust the Russians. They're sort of one perceived slight away from trying to take over the world.
Sure.
And then also sort of Bond as an instrument of state and carrying out Her Majesty government's policy and subject to sort of bureaucratic oversight and squabbling. So I realized earlier on, I think GoldenEye influenced that sort of understanding of Bond.
Totally. Well, I mean, Bond is so interesting because of that, right? Because of, I like this idea of as an instrument of the state. And I mean, from a film history perspective, which is where I, sort of come at these films now, it's great because you can track, a half century of like international affairs through these movies, and a half century of sort of what the, this is an outside perspective, right? As an American, but what the British self, is going through. What does the like British cultural psyche try to work throughout the later half of the 20th century? And even though these movies are goofy and often silly, and they're, space lasers and invisible cars and, you name it, they're still tackling some of these bigger things, especially a film like GoldenEye, which is really grappling with, what is the purpose not only of James Bond in a post-Cold War era, but what's the purpose of the entire, espionage apparatus we've built up for 40 years, maybe for nothing or maybe for something, right?
Those bloody Russians.
They're coming.
But I mean, like, it sort of made me think about, I remember first thinking this about Skyfall, that unlike a lot of quote unquote superhero franchises, and by superhero I mean sort of there is one superhero that the film is built around who foils bad guys, I guess. If we consider Bond as a superhero character, I sort of thought how I think maybe he's the only franchise where like the superhero is rooted in an institution.
Yeah.
And the reason Skyfall made me first think about this was there are two sides. Like, on the one hand, Bond is only an instrument of state. He puts into violent action the policies of the government. I was going through the films in my head, and I was thinking, like, From Russia with Love, it's about getting an advantage over the Soviets by stealing a code machine.
Yep.
In The Living Daylights, it's aiding the defection of a Soviet general.
Yeah.
And then I think they also mention how I think M mentions this, or the Minister of Defense, that like this will put them in good stead with the Americans because they haven't had such a good sort of espionage success for a long time. And then Tomorrow Never Dies, the opening, it's managing the threats from the post-Soviet space, like, you know, state collapse, loose nuclear weapons, so everything like that. And then Quantum of Solace, opening with him executing a traitor.
Right.
Yeah. So I thought, so that's on the one hand. He's unlike a superhero, say like a Superman or a Batman, who's like deciding their own stuff.
Yeah.
Bond is under orders, and usually he's shown to be given orders by the wider system.
Yeah.
And then I also thought like he's shown to be subject to bureaucracy. And I was sort of thinking like the introduction of M in GoldenEye is very much like, you know,
Ice Queen.
The Ice Queen, crunching the numbers, sending out an analyst to sort of look after him. I thought the Tomorrow Never Dies, the squabbling between M and the Admiral, is like, you know, bureaucratic turf war. And then in Skyfall, there's the whole inquiry into M's leadership. And it's like one of the like superhero films you see like the bureaucracy.
Right. Yeah. And in the Dark Knight, sort of the worst thing that happens is you have Alfred, you know, tell Batman, you're building like a horrible conservative weapon of espionage, and I want nothing to do with it. Like that's the most oversight you've got. But I think I was actually thinking about this the other day because I recently rewatched On Her Majesty's Secret Service, and there's this sort of hokey bit where Bond goes into his office, and it's the first time there's a new Bond. It's the sixth film. You've got George Lazenby, so he like is going through his desk, and he pulls out, you know, all the sort of accoutrement from the last films, and they play the themes. You know, he pulls out the briefcase from Russia with Love, and the theme song plays over it. It's sort of silly, but I love it because in the novels, Bond is sort of always going back to the office. And the novels, Fleming really makes it clear that Bond is like a desk jockey sometimes, that is part of the job, and he doesn't like it, but that's part of the work, that he isn't just a superhero. He's not just a super spy, but, you know, Commander Bond has to fill out paperwork. And you don't get a whole lot of that in the movies, but I love it because it is something more, and it grounds the films in, the reality of, like, you know, state espionage and state action. No matter what, someone somewhere in, you know, the Pentagon or an MI6 is filling out a form because they blew up a car or whatever.
I mean, I was sort of thinking about like the Avengers. The whole plot of Avengers Civil War is half of the superheroes believe that they shouldn't be subject to rules and institutional oversight, and them being kind of right to believe that. I said I first thought about this with Skyfall, of like, it's very much like there is a democracy that I guess oversees Bond and gives him orders, whereas there's also something sort of quasi-fascistic about Batman and the Avengers, because it's very much the superhero deciding what's good and what's bad, on behalf of everyone else.
It's a fantastic tension that all of these kind of movies play with. The sort of the appeal of having one person who can make the right decision. And I don't have to think about it. Batman will save the day. Batman will always do the right thing. But the reality is that that fantasy is a fantasy that has like authoritarian, you know, anxieties rooted in it, that has a fascist kind of aesthetic to it. And also, I mean, Batman in particular is sort of a conservative coded villain or not villain hero, where like Batman's whole purpose is
who recorded this podcast, the Joker.
Like if Superman is about truth, justice in the American way, Batman is about vengeance, right? Like, there's a reason why Batman only comes out at night. And yes, he's like taking care of criminals, but Batman is a billionaire who maintains the status quo. That's not like a sexy liberal kind of thing. That said, James Bond, even though he's subject to oversight, one of the tensions that's constant in these movies, he's constantly quitting because M won't let him do the thing he wants to do. And I'm going to give in my license to kill and go solve this. License to Kill is sort of built around the idea that neither the British nor the Americans are doing enough to solve, this problem of Central American drugs and a vengeance killing of Felix Leiter. So Bond has to take it into his own hands. They're an interesting thing that they're constantly playing with these tensions about. Can we govern ourselves on our own, or do we need somebody that will just do it for us?
There's a point I really want to make about License to Kill, but it's part of like a wider discussion. So
okay.
So
go into it.
The nominal focus of this episode is Bond and strategy, and I was sort of thinking that I sort of view that the practice of strategy it's on a spectrum, and on the one end is you put a lot of thought, careful consideration into like choosing a goal, and then you do a lot of planning and thinking about ways and means, and you do it all before you actually put anything into action. So that's one end of the spectrum. And then on the other end of the spectrum, it's much more instinctual, reactive. You know sort of instinctively what your goal is, what actions you need to take, what forces are arrayed against you, what you need to do to overcome them. It's very much like a chain reaction in your mind, and you're just always acting. And I was sort of thinking how like the Bond films are usually about the conflict between the villains who are at one end of the spectrum, who come up with like the fiendish plan to take over the world, and then Bond is the reactive, intuitive spoiler.
Sure.
And then I was sort of thinking about how like Bond can't help but be reactive and intuitive because he is reacting to the first move of the villains in the fiendish plan.
Yeah.
One exception, or there might be more exceptions, but the only one I can think of is License to Kill, where Bond himself acts the villain, the haunter of my nightmares. To my mind, he's not really entangled with MI6, or I know he kills Felix Leiter, but there's no like state policy.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, he kills an American, or he attempts to kill. Leiter survives, but his wife doesn't. In the opening, spoilers for a film that's 30 years old at this point, 36 years old.
I don't know if you noticed this, but like I love Timothy Dalton.
He's my favorite.
I feel, but you may disagree, but I feel he was underserved by the films he did.
I think Living Daylights is one of the best Bond films. Watching License to Kill immediately after is such a letdown. And I'm a Dalton guy. I want to defend both of them in like huge ways, because I think he gets like the dark cynicism that Fleming writes into the character in a way that nobody else really does. not even Connery, not even Craig. But License to Kill, I mean, I just watched this, and because it begins with an American problem, and Bond is just there because Felix Leiter is getting married. That's the setup. And then the Americans don't do anything, so Bond has to go take a revenge mission. It just becomes this like American problem. And even though global politics in the second half of the 20th century like aren't neatly confined to, you know, national boundaries, Bond as a franchise, as a cinematic experience is a British thing. And to sort of effectively make an American film, it just like, it doesn't work for me. And it's interesting. It's the first film that they make entirely out of the UK. For tax reasons, they decided to they didn't film at Pinewood. And I don't know, it's just like, it sort of like feels it becomes this problem where you're like, well, Bond has no reason to be here. This has nothing to do with the state. M shows up and is like, this has nothing to do with us. Let the Americans handle it. And, you know, Bond is blinded by, you know, rage and a sense of what's right and wrong and justice. But that also isn't necessarily what Bond's character is. So it as a film, just doesn't land the way that the other ones do for me.
Well, I had to stop watching it at the point where, I mean, I've seen it before, obviously, because it tortured my toddler's nightmares. But I tried to watch it last year, I think, and I had to stop at the moment where there's a continuity break. Mm-hmm. Where Timothy Dalton sees Felix Leiter's murdered wife. Mm-hmm. And lying on the bed, and he's like, Stella, and she's on the bed with her eyes closed like that.
Yeah.
Obviously, this is I forgot this is a podcast. She's like lying on her back, eyes closed. But looks like a normal, like she looks like she's sleeping.
Yeah.
And it cuts to Timothy Dalton's face, looking all like concerned and heartbroken. Then it cuts back to the wife, and her eyes are open, and she's got like this horrified look on her face. And at that moment, I thought, like, oh, I need to stop. Like, I love you, Timothy, but I need to stop.
Yeah, it's underserved. He's underserved by it, and we can talk about strategy. I'll just wrap up my thoughts on this film because I just watched it the other day. This is the last film made by John Glenn, who directed 5 Bond films, beginning with For Your Eyes Only. He was a second AD on a couple films before that. And John Glenn is one of my favorite Bond directors, even though those 5 films, 2 of them I think are great, and the other 3 I think are sort of fine. Or 3 of them I think are great, and the other 2 are fine. But what makes Glenn so compelling as a director is the way that he is constantly intercutting like close-ups and wide shots to keep the tension both there, but also to make the action sort of visible. As a viewer, you're never confused as to like what the spatial properties of the film are. And in License to Kill, all of a sudden it goes out the door, and it's because I think it's sort of a frenzied script. It's trying to do like 5 different things. I mean, there's the whole evangelical subplot with Wayne Newton, and John Glenn just like loses it totally, and it's no longer, doesn't feel like his movie in the way that For Your Eyes Only or The Living Daylights do. So anyway, strategy.
well, so again, this is going off strategy, but well, it speaks to something that it sort of set thought off in my mind when you sent me a screenshot of some of your notes talking about franchise strategy, and I was something that's always interested me is they know the Broccolis know. Society knows how to make a good Bond film.
Sure.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Yep.
So why does it seem that so many Bond films are through together
Yeah.
and missed the mark?
I think this is great. You were just now talking about strategy as existing on the spectrum of planning, having a goal, understanding the ways and means, and something that's instinctual and reactive. And I would argue that when Bond films go wrong, and they do go wrong, there are some that are not good, and I love them all. But it is when the filmmaking organization, the Broccoli's and everyone involved, it's not just them, right? It's whoever they choose as the director. But when they go reactive, when they choose to react too much to what is happening, either in the sort of the ambient culture or reacting to the previous film. And case in point, on Her Majesty's Secret Service, a film that I think at the time, like, felt like a little bit of a miss. George Lazenby was signed for, I think, 7 Bond films. He returned most of the check after making the one and said Bond is not going to be a thing in the 70s. And so what do they do? And it's a more emotional, sort of darker story. Famously, Bond gets married in the film, and that does not work out well. And so the next film is Diamonds Are Forever, and it's just this reactive, radioactive mess where we have to get Sean Connery back because they audition a couple other people, but Sean Connery we know is going to be James Bond, and it just sort of becomes this mess of like asking what were the things that worked. So okay, Blofeld worked. Let's bring Blofeld back. Instead of Donald Pleasance, we have Charles Gray in his second appearance in the franchise as like a very boring Blofeld. He's got another crazy idea, crazy space laser plot that is different, but not effectively different from Thunderball or You Only Live Twice. And they bring back Guy Hamilton as a director. So Guy Hamilton directed 4 Bond films. The first one was Goldfinger, like an established classic, a film that sort of doesn't really fail. They bring him back. He hadn't made one since for Diamonds Are Forever. They bring Sean Connery back. They bring Shirley Bassey back to do a theme. It's one of the best themes, which is such a shame because the movie is a mess.
Also,
yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, but
No.
License to Kill also has one of the best songs.
It is my favorite song. Gladys Knight, when the very end of it, when she like doubles down on it, I'm going to play it as soon as I hang up this call. No, but so I think, as a franchise, it's fun to think about, well, what are the strategies being employed to make this an enduring thing? Obviously, Bond isn't going anywhere. They've made 26 of these. It's going to sort of keep going, but just because it has been going isn't a sure deal, right? Like it could end. And so there has to be some kind of strategic thinking into it. I mean, on the other hand, right, I just said that when they get too reactive, it doesn't work. On the other hand, Casino Royale is a correction to Die Another Day, which is a sloppy mess as well. And that worked out in the favor. So, I mean, I think this speaks to your notion of strategy as a spectrum. There is a side of it that is reactive, but it requires good instincts. When those instincts are good, maybe you get a Casino Royale. When the instincts aren't good, you get Diamonds Are Forever.
Well, I mean, I remember reading about No Time to Die was in trouble. And Daniel Craig brought in Phoebe Waller-Bridges as to work on the script.
Mm-hmm.
So being a Fleabag fan, I thought, like, oh, like that's great.
Yeah.
And and then when I saw the film, I wondered just how bad was the script that that this is what Phoebe Waller-Bridges was able to spruce up.
Yeah.
And so and that's what made me think about, like, we roughly know what makes a good Bond film.
Mm-hmm.
So how does a production like No Time to Die
Yeah.
become such a white elephant?
Yeah. No. I have a friend, my buddy Will, and I are constantly talking about James Bond. Shout out to Will if you're listening. Hey, what's up, man? Hey, bro. And we sort of like to say that there are 3 Daniel Craig Bond films, and both of us are huge defenders of Quantum of Solace, which I admit has, like, has its problems. Writing a film during a writer's strike without writers is problematic, is going to give you not a great movie. But I respect what it's doing. And then there are Spectre and No Time to Die, which, are bummers for me. I actually was thinking the other day, and I am speaking out of my ass here, but famously, Barbara Broccoli, who has complete creative control over the Bond cinematic franchise, is not a fan of Amazon, who owns MGM. And they bought MGM to produce films and television series and, content, derogatory use of the word there, with the existing intellectual property that MGM owns. That was the purpose of the acquisition. There's a great story in the Wall Street Journal a couple weeks ago about the early meetings between the Broccoli's and Amazon, and Amazon saying, we can do spin-off shows with, some of the secondary characters from the last couple movies. We can do reality television, whatever, right? Like, we've got this great character and we can just, like, exploit it to high hell. But they can't do anything without Barbara Broccoli okaying it. And I was sort of thinking the other day, maybe Bond dies at the end of No Time to Die, as like a, sort of quasi-political statement from Barbara Broccoli saying, like, this goes nowhere without me. If I want to kill James Bond, I can do it, and I can bring it back, but I'll bring it back on my time when I am ready. And when, you bow to me. It's Bezos bowing to Broccoli, not Broccoli bowing to Bezos. I have no proof that is the case, but it's an interesting reading.
Did you see the reality show they tried to do?
No. Did you?
I thought I'd give it a go because it's Brian Cox.
So in this Wall Street Journal article, they reveal, maybe you know this, Brian Cox thought he was signing up for a James Bond film. And then he found out that he signed up for this reality show.
How dare they do that to Brian Cox? I tried to watch it because I love a good. It was like a sort of race around the world kind of
right
step up, and you would like solve like kind of like something between Race Around the World and like The Traitors kind of like vibe.
Sure.
And I think I only got like 10 minutes in to the episode, and I had to stop. It was like,
yeah.
And I love a good trashy reality show.
Sure.
But yeah, I had to go. I'm sorry, I can't. We were talking about sort of strategy on a spectrum. And something I was thinking about, I said that on the one end, the Bond villains are the super planners. They game out every step. And I thought that, like, an example that like comes top of mind is from Russia with Love, where Spectre has a really complex, gamed out strategy as devised by the chess master Kronstein. And it's very much like both Spectre's actions and the reactions of everyone else are expected to play out exactly as they imagine, because the strategy is so well gamed out.
Sure.
Like that, they there's no room for spoiling. Even James Bond being a spoiler is folded into the plan.
Yeah.
And then I was sort of thinking that because I love Robert Shaw and I love Grant.
So good.
And I was sort of thinking how like Grant is kind of in the middle of the spectrum because he games out moves and counter moves, but also quickly reacts to unexpected events and like nudges them back on the course that he wants. That he uses the line to Bond about how, and I love this line, that he was Bond's guardian angel, and
Right.
the way he would like pick off various people, and Bond just being oblivious to what is happening around him, but Grant is like the firm hand on the tiller who's like directing everything.
Everything. Yeah. From Russia with Love is the best Bond film. And I think one of the reasons why it is just simply at the level of the narrative. It is doing exactly what you're saying. So, let's see if we can really quickly recap this, and you fill me in, because I famously, only remember about half of a plot. I don't watch movies that way. British intelligence wants to get the Lecter device, which is a encoding device, and they Spectre is this like sort of extra state terrorist organization, and they basically tell the British intelligence, "Hey, we have this woman who wants to defect and bring a Lecter." But she's going to do it to James Bond because she's in love with him. British intelligence is like, well, this is clearly a trap. But if we have the chance to get the Lecter, like, we got to figure out a way to do it. So we will send James Bond. And Bond goes, they get the Lecter, and then he gets on a train with Tatiana, the Russian agent who doesn't realize that she is working for Spectre, right? She is a Soviet who works in like the what do you call the international place inside the consulate in Istanbul, and they get on the Orient Express to get the hell out of there, cross the enemy lines, and on the Orient Express, a Spectre agent, Grant, Robert Shaw, arrives, and his plan is to kill both Bond and Tatiana because she doesn't matter. She's a Soviet. He's Spectre. And it goes from there. Is that, give or take, sort of the strategic plot of From Russia with Love?
Before that, there are bits where there's a Bulgarian KGB chief assassin who is going to murder Bond in the San Sofia Cathedral, but Grant murders him before he can. And then there's a particular bit that I love. It's so well filmed. It's like a tracking shot where in the mix of all this is the head of Turkish intelligence who is working with
Kerim Bey.
Yeah. And he is on the train with Bond, helping him get out Tatiana and this Lecter device. And they capture a Russian KGB agent. And Kerim Bey is like, I'll keep watch over him.
Sure.
And James Bond's like, fine, that's great. And then they go back. He goes back to his cabin with Tatiana. And then Grant killed both Kerim Bey and the KGB spy.
Right.
And then James Bond finds out. They stop off at like some station in Turkey after Istanbul. And Kerim Bey has all his sons working for him as agents. And James Bond tells one of them, your father's been murdered. And in the background on the train, Grant is just listening. And then like the son says, "Oh, I'm gonna go tell my brothers we will help you out this way or that way, whatever."
Sure.
So he walks off, and then Bond starts walking back down the track to get on the train. And as he does, in the half light on the train, Grant is just follows him along.
Yes.
The tracking shot, like along the train, it's just so good. Like,
yeah. Well, it's a complex, complicated international espionage story where it's not just. Importantly, this is Spectre. It's not SMERSH anymore. So we've changed evil organizations from the first film, and it's not the Soviets, right? Like it is an extra state actor, which is interesting, especially because we think about this era of Bond films as being sort of a Cold War situation. And I mean, GoldenEye, as we said before, right? Like famously, M is like, you are a dinosaur of the Cold War. It's a great line. That's the challenge of Bond in the 21st century. But what's interesting is Bond's biggest sort of villains are not necessarily the Soviets. It's these like extra state actors, which is a much more contemporary concern, right? Like that's far more related to, I think, our world in the 21st century than it necessarily was in the 1960s. I'm painting with a wide brush in terms of international politics right now.
Well, I mean, like it's fascinating for a while of like the in-universe geopolitics of the Bond world, because like I think in contrast to like a lot of espionage dramas, and like even like everyone puts as the contrast Ian Fleming and James Bond and John le Carré,
right.
And I was thinking about this on the train earlier, that rarely are the Soviets the main enemy of James Bond. They are always extra state, usually billionaires,
Yep.
who are up to nefarious ends, who are outside of the Cold War polarization.
Yep.
And like I was sort of thinking about how we were talking about the book Moonraker, and
great book.
Yeah, and in that, Drax is a billionaire industrialist rocket maker.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah, who has Nazi sympathies.
Sounds familiar.
And then I was sort of, even from Russia with Love, that Spectre's big plan is they are going to capture the Lecter to sell it back to the Russians.
Right.
And so they're going to make money that way. And then also the whole You Only Live Twice, that Spectre taking out both American and Russian space programs.
Yep.
With the help of Japanese industrialists. And in a lot of these cases, it's usually like they are not, because the last time you were on, we were talking about the Manchurian Candidate and the Cold War influence on these films and the messages. Mm-hmm. Whereas in a lot of the Bond films, it's not really about the Cold War, which a lot of people don't seem to get.
Well, we don't ever really talk about Bond from like a like class sort of perspective. But as you point out, Bond is constantly fighting against billionaires. And what's interesting is it's even when it is not explicitly like a billionaire industrialist in the way that Tomorrow Never Dies is where you have Carter, played by Jonathan Pryce, as this like, CNN news executive who's going to control the world via the news. And he's a billionaire. Ernst Stravo Blofeld has to be billionaire adjacent, right? Like you don't get a secret volcano lair without like some kind of access to billionaire kind of funds, even if Blofeld's in-universe bank account is not, he still has the capacity to get money. In Diamonds Are Forever, he kidnaps a billionaire named Willard White, who's sort of a Howard Hughes recluse character. Bond is constantly going up against like this like extreme form of private capital, that like if private capital runs amok, as we know it does, somebody has to come in and regulate it. And the state on its face throughout the 20th century wants to regulate it less and less. And this is both true. This is true for both America and the UK, right? You get this neoliberal project, which is like, well, yeah, the taxes in the 50s and 60s were too much, so billionaires can keep their money. But we also clearly recognize the problem of letting billionaires have this much power and influence. And the Bond films take it to the extreme. The extreme is, well, they will build, space lasers. But what's horrifying is that we live in a moment in which those extremes are quite tangible and real. And we do have like coked out, ketamine infused billionaires building rocket ships with like weird eugenic ideologies trying to colonize Mars. Or billionaires owning the Washington Post. I mean, like, it's there.
I don't know if you saw, but there was a story the other day that the British anti-terrorism unit is looking into Musk because of the radicalization that he seems to be showing online.
Sure.
And
somebody should.
and so I was sort of thinking how a megalomaniac billionaire is coming under the scrutiny of the British state.
Sounds like something for James Bond to handle.
And there's this just came into my mind as you were talking. There is a book called The Free Market and the Strong State. It's by actually a Marxist academic called, I forgot his name, but basically it's a book about Margaret Thatcher. And the overall argument was that in order to have a free market, there has to be a strong state. And the problem that Britain had in the 70s was that not so much that the market wasn't free, it was that the state was weak.
Sure.
And there were these overmighty subjects, and in the 70s they were trade unions, who would constrain the state by, if the coal miners union didn't like something the British government did, they would just shut off the lights in Britain. And so the argument of this book was that in order to create a more free neoliberal sort of market in Britain, Thatcher had to make the state strong and sort of clamp down on trade unions, similar to sort of Reagan in America. And that, because I studied this at university, and the books always stay with me.
Yeah,
kind of as a model. But I was sort of thinking that it goes the other way as well. That
Yeah.
there can't be any overmighty subjects with private capital who can just like brush away the state.
Yeah.
And yeah, and I love that you also brought up Elliot Carver, because I love Tomorrow Never Dies.
It's a great movie.
It is a great movie. And you can talk more about this, it's your idea. About misdirection as part of strategy.
Yeah, I mean, so Elliot Carver is interesting because he's this billionaire news guy, and the goal is for Elliot Carver, right, is not to be elected president, or to, you know, sort of rule over the world as like a Blofeld style authoritarian. Although, as an aside, what's really interesting in Diamonds Are Forever, I have to bring up because I just watched it last night, is Blofeld makes this claim that like by destroying the major powers, by destroying Washington, D.C. And Moscow, he'll allow the world to finally be free of fear of the poles of the Cold War, which I thought was a really sort of subversive thought to put into one of these films. And Blofeld, all of a sudden, while his means are technically deplorable, no longer seems like this like scary, I want to rule the world figure, but rather like, oh, maybe there's a point. Maybe the extreme poles of our political ideologies during the Cold War were not the right way to handle the problem. Anyway, Elliot Carver in Tomorrow Never Dies, he's not interested in nominal rule, but he wants power. And so the way he is going to go about that is by controlling news information, and more by making news information. So, he's out there creating international problems sort of in order to have the first, bite at the news story, so he can constantly break the news. But by being able to break the news, he can force international powers, in this case, China and the UK, into conflict, and then he can sort of fill the vacuum created by these two superpowers in conflict, which is also that's the case of we call it the Yellow War here in America, where you have I'm not.
Was it Randolph Hearst?
It's Hearst. Yeah, it's Hearst. I was like Citizen Kane, where Hearst is effectively making up news stories and publishing them in order to create international conflicts with Cuba. And I'm sorry? Spain. Yes, I know that. I'm a smart person with Spain.
I mean, there's the line which I think it's an actual. I think William Randolph Hearst actually said it, which was, "You provide me the pictures, I'll provide you the war."
Sure. Even if he didn't, it's a great line. Let's attribute it to him.
But yeah, I like what you were talking about. Like when we were talking about this, that the villains often like misdirecting Bond and everyone else as to what their real goals are. So there's the ostensible goal, and then there's the actual goal.
Yeah, like Goldfinger, I always forget how Goldfinger like works from a strategic level, and Auric Goldfinger, again a billionaire industrialist, his goal halfway through the film, it seems, is to break into Fort Knox. And why would a man obsessed with gold break into Fort Knox? Clearly to steal all the gold. And then you get to the final act of the film, and you realize that he's going to set off a nuclear bomb in Fort Knox. And so the goal isn't to take the gold, it's to irradiate the gold and to force everybody into a new gold supply, because all of Fort Knox's gold will no longer be usable for, a century and a half or whatever the half-life of the bomb is. And that's a great like misdirection. From a film perspective, as an audience member, it's such a surprise because clearly this must operate in the one way. It must be that he's stealing the gold. Bad guys steal things, etc. And then you're like, oh no, this is like, that is devilish. That is devious. That's a horrifying thought. I love it. It's fantastic.
And then the other one is maybe I should rewatch it on your strength, but Quantum of Solace.
Quantum of Solace is look, it has its problems, but it's fun. Quantum of Solace, the villain we think is trying to consolidate power by putting in place these dictators in Central American countries, and this is 2009 or something. So the West, right, is wrapped up in all of these wars that are about oil in some way, shape, or form. So you think this is going to be a film about oil, and there's this great moment where the villain dips a woman a la Goldfinger into oil, and you get her body splayed out on bed, covered in oil. Clearly the film is going to be about this, and it's not. It's about water, because water is a much more important resource in the grand scheme of things, and will only be increasingly important. And then it's like a sort of doubly interesting thing, because the way all of this works is that the villain is putting these despots into power through sort of violent military means, establishing coups. Spoiler alert, he's in bed with the CIA. But in order for the dictators to then maintain power, they must sign contracts with the villain's company, which gives the villain's company, first rights to all of these resources, namely water. And then the state will then need to purchase those resources back from the villain. And there's a great moment when this newly, elected military leader is confronted with his contract, and he says, I'm not going to sign this. Like, I'm the president of the country now. And the guy's like, well, to remind you, we killed the last guy in order for you to be here. We'll kill you too. It won't be hard. And that's a fantastic, I actually think we started talking about strategy in Bond a couple weeks ago, and you talked about villains. You were the first one to sort of bring up villains, and it got me thinking, and all I could think about for the last couple of weeks were the villains, and how are the villains, like, strategic imperatives operating. They're a little bit more interesting, I think, than saving the world.
Well, I mean, and that's kind of what I was thinking about today, about how because I was struggling with Bond as a strategist.
Yeah.
And then it occurred to me today on the train that Bond is I say strategy is achieving your ambitions as stuff outside your control tries to stop you.
Mm-hmm.
And it occurred to me that Bond is the stuff. He's not the he's not the what's the word? Like, he not the object or not the subject. He's like he is merely reacting to the strategy of the villain.
The films then, in this framing, and I love this. This is fantastic. The films are not really about Bond or about the status quo. They are about failed strategies for world domination, which is a really interesting way of looking at these films, because our cultural training is to look at them through the lens of a hero. James Bond is the hero. He will save the day. That's great. But instead, you are completely right. All he is doing is like blocking. He is the immovable object in many ways to all of their plans that then sort of necessarily fail because of who James Bond is and what the culture sort of dictates. But that's just a beautiful way of thinking about these movies. Oh my gosh.
Something I do like about Quantum of Solace, which is more a behind the scenes thing, is that the actor who plays the villain, Matthew Almeric,
yes,
he apparently went to Michael Lonsdale, who played Drax in Moonraker, and asked him advice on how to be a Bond villain.
I love that.
Yeah, and I love Michael Lonsdale. So I do like that there was that that history, I guess, informing the present. Because have you seen the Day of the Jackal, the film?
No, I haven't.
It's amazing.
Excellent, right? Yeah, it's perpetually on my watch list.
So Michael Lonsdale plays the detective who has to try and foil the assassin, who is his mission is to assassinate Charles de Gaulle to facilitate a military coup in France because of Algeria and so everything like that. And Michael Lonsdale is excellent as almost a bumbling detective who nevertheless, but everyone views him as like bumbling, but actually there's a sort of almost George Smiley-esque. There's a serious calculating thought, like thinking behind it. Right. Well, I guess end with who do you think might be the next Bond?
I have no idea.
And if you can't come to a conclusion on that, what sort of Bond should it be?
Let me answer. I'm going to give you a non-answer answer. James Bond series strategically needs to lay fallow for a couple years. It's interesting. They've pumped these movies out year after year. There's this what we collectively consider this huge break between License to Kill in 1989 and GoldenEye in 1995. It's only 6 years. And that's the amount of time that surpassed between Spectre and No Time to Die. And we're now, what is it? It's 2025 now. We're 4 years from when they wrapped No Time to Die. People are, sort of banging on the doors asking for the next James Bond. Who will it be? When are we going to get it? We're going to get it. But I think what happens, what is best is when we take a little bit of a break. We reset the expectations for what the character is. We can go into it not reacting poorly to, the perceived excesses of the previous films, and instead see it fresh, let it be unique and interesting. This will be an interesting one because it necessarily must be unique and interesting. Are they, hard rebooting the series? Are we going to get Casino Royale 2.0 again? Are we just going to ignore the last one? Will they explain away, the way it works? Is the code a code that is passed around? They're all different Bonds, whatever. None of those sort of things really interest me. I'm excited. James Bond will return. But if the Broccoli's are listening, take your time. There's no reason to rush this. Let's come back in a couple years and be ready to go. And I can't wait to sit down for the next one.
I mean, I would like a lighter Bond, not Roger Moore light, but maybe a Pierce Brosnan light.
Well, I mean, that's the way. If we sort of see them in a pattern where you have Connery as maybe a baseline, the lightness of Moore, darkness of Dalton, Pierce Brosnan is really playing in a more kind of tableau, and then the sort of dark, emotional grittiness of Daniel Craig. We are sort of technically due for the lighter Bond. Maybe we'll get it. Is the culture ready for lightness, or are we still stuck in this gritty superhero nonsense? Who knows?
Well, it's what I as a kid I loved Batman. I love the animated series. I loved
it.
Tim Burton's films, and I think someone said to me like last year or something, "Oh, have you seen the Batman with Robert Pattinson?" Mm-hmm. And then people have asked me if I've seen the Penguin series. Mm-hmm. I was just like, I'm sick of Batman. Like,
I can't be asked, dude.
Yeah.
Who cares?
There was a great. I remember seeing this on Twitter like a few years ago. It was stills from each Batman film, and it was like I don't know. It might have been like 1960s Adam West,
yeah,
where it's like bright Technicolor, and then it's Tim Burton 1988, and then which is a smidgen darker, and then it was sort of the George Clooney or Val Kilmer.
Val Kilmer.
Right.
Batman. Yeah, Batman Forever.
Is it Val Kilmer then George Clooney or the other way around?
It's Val Kilmer then George Clooney, yeah.
So again, a little bit darker still. The Dark Knight, even darker. Robert Pattinson's one, which is almost pitch black. and then it had like 2028, and it was just a black screen.
So I'm exhausted.
So I could do it like I'm sick of these gritty reboots. Maybe the Trump years will mean people will need some escapism.
Yeah, I mean, if like a series like Ted Lasso was successful because we were all so tired of the world feeling like it was actively trying to kill us, maybe the next Bond will be something a little bit lighter. Movies respond to their times. They're dynamic like that. But no matter what, James Bond will return, and that's important.
Paul, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I want to thank Paul again for sparing the time to talk to me. You can find his socials in the show notes, as well as mine. If you enjoyed the show, please like, rate, and comment. Hope you all tune in again next week.